Hello and welcome to our presentation. We'd like to thank everybody for being here for this, and we'd like to thank the conference planners for the opportunity to present our ideas to this esteemed group. I'm Anthony Wachs. I'm a professor at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm a professor of rhetoric and communication studies. I've done a little bit of work with Tolkien, um, especially as it relates to rhetorical theory and cultural studies. And this is my son, Michael, who is the definite resident Tolkien scholar in the family. And we have been working together on this paper since we heard about the conference theme, and we really fell in love with what was the opportunity of this discussion, and it's been the basis for a great discussion between the two of us. And so at this point, what I'm going to have Michael do is introduce our introduction to you of the paper to give a sense of what it was that we ended up writing about.
Exploring the challenges of illustrating J.R.R. Tolkien's imaginative masterpiece into visual form is an important subject of study, because the topic has immense consequences well beyond critically evaluating the merit of the attempts to do so. In particular, the topic significantly relates to the human experience itself. The process of translation requires an attentiveness to both the intentions of the original author and the experience of the receiver of the translation, such that the message is understood accurately. How translation takes place within the act of communication is not a trivial matter. The challenge of translation can easily be seen in the complexity of intercultural communication. Translating words and ideas from one language and culture into another cannot be done in a linear fashion that reduces the meaning to its lowest form. As any reader of the Inklings, but especially Owen Barfield knows, words carry with them deep cultural significance, i.e., implied instructions for perceiving and interacting in the world, that are not inherently shared between cultures. For instance, the word sinistra in Latin means left hand and carries with it a deep cultural meaning of distrust of left-handedness. Similarly, translating Tolkien's literary vision into visual form is more than just copying the literal sense of what was written. Fortunately, Tolkien provides insight into standards by which these can properly be performed. Specifically, we argue that these principles can be found in Tolkien's On Fairy Stories and Leaf by Niggle. In these works, Tolkien argues engaging in fantasy is perhaps the greatest art, for it imagines something that is not of this world. The primary challenge, then, of translating an act of the imagination into a visual form concerns how one honors the essence of the author's vision. In establishing this approach to translating Tolkien's works into visual form, we provide principles by which artists, scholars, and fans can judge the merit of various depictions of Tolkien's works, in addition to providing means of criticism of adaptation of Tolkien's stories. We argue that these principles can be found in the translating of the world of fairy in the imagination to the visual form of illustration.
So, with that kind of overall depiction in mind, what we want to do is just kind of overview some of the main principles that we came across in our research and developed as our kind of theoretical basis for understanding the translative act into visual form. And obviously, one of the first things that came up in our research was the questions of authority and authorship, which is natural in humanities scholarship today. How much weight should we give the author's intentions? And this was especially most apparent within the visual depictions of The Lord of the Rings in Peter Jackson's films. Specifically because of their wide popularity, they have ended up being the only source that many people have with engaging with the Lord of the Rings. They've watched the movies, but they've never read the books. And so there becomes this whole question of who gets to be really kind of the authority in terms of what is Lord of the Rings and what is not? Is it within Tolkien? Is it Jackson? Where are the dividing lines there? Interestingly, also in visual form, this came up in terms of Helen Young's research on video games and the history of depictions of either Lord of the Rings video games, The Hobbit, or just worlds that were based upon Tolkien's vision. But this was most important in terms of how control was being kept through licensing efforts. Along those lines, one of the most interesting components that is developed is by Robinson in her depiction of how video games have drawn this fine line between what is the passive nature of a fictional character that is more or less just a part of a plot line in a video game versus when video games have become interactive and the character becomes a simulation that is bound by the video game itself, but also given creativity and what they can do by the player. So, what we wanted to know with this context was the importance of recognizing that within these questions is a debate. You have the most purist end of things with Christopher Tolkien. Michael would probably end up on that end of the spectrum. To the other end of kind of a more postmodern, the author is dead, and so authorial intent is just out the window, and we are free to have creative license to do whatever we want. I probably stand somewhere in between those two realms. That there has to be some give and take in terms of how it translates into new times and new cultures, but we should always be attentive to at least the spirit of what was being done. And that's what really leads us into the more theoretical principles that guide what we consider good translation versus bad translation. And so, where we wanted to start off with this was really within the idea of details. And this was really the principal idea that was given to us from Leaf by Niggle. In Leaf by Niggle, as you all are aware, the true art of Niggle is found within his beautiful depiction of the details and intricacies of individual leaves. And for us, we took this as a principle of stating why the details that are provided by the author, in this sense Tolkien, should in some senses be respected, but changes can also take place. Especially because what Niggle was so iffy on was in terms of the whole, how the leaves related to the tree, how the tree related to the environment. And so it really gave us a principle of ambiguity of how we relate details to the whole or the essence of the story itself. As we'll talk about with on fairy stories, that's where we'll have principles relating to the whole, but this is where we want to talk about simply just the details. And so at this kind of artistic form coming from Leaf by Niggle, we wanted to do a brief set of examples in terms of the details specific to characters and why that matters. And this would be by extension to, say, the environments and how they're depicted visually. So at this point, Michael will talk about a character description in terms of the details of where they, in fact, really do matter.
A good example of if a translator cares for the importance of details is how they depict characters. An interesting character to do this with is Aragorn. An easy way to do this is not in the details such as what color hair he has or how tall his boots are, but if he has a beard. Now this seems like a very trivial detail, but it has much more significance and deeper meaning to it. This is because Tolkien describes his characters in specific ways. This is done in part with Aragorn by him not having a beard. This is important because generally the trait of those who have elvish blood is that they have no beard. We see this in Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. Tolkien says that this trait is much lasting. This means that although it does not last forever, it lasts a very long time. This trait was definitely still in effect in the time of Aragorn, so he would have a beard, or he would not have a beard. Tolkien confirms this in a letter to a fan. This is an example of how we can judge the small yet important details in the visual translation of Tolkien's Middle-earth. Aragorn is depicted with the beard in Jackson, Rankin and Bass, and the Lego adaptations of The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn is depicted without a beard in the Russian Chronatelli and the Bakshi Lord of the Rings.
So along these lines, the details, they have changes to in some senses, the nature of Aragorn related to his elvish descent. But those details may not be readily available to those that just watch in passing. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about was the details as they conform, more importantly, to changes within plotline. So we wanted to discuss very quickly an obvious example of change in plotline that has an effect upon the story in its translation into visual form.
An example of this is found in the Peter Jackson adaptation of The Hobbit. In this adaptation, Azog is alive. Now, as we all know, Azog has been dead for a long time. In fact, 142 years prior, he'd been killed by Thorin's cousin Dain II. Bringing Azog back from the dead was a blatant disregard for what was written in the books. This deviation from Tolkien's story and plot is not for any justified reason, but solely for the ability to fit in all the battle, blood, and gore Peter Jackson could not fit into The Lord of the Rings. We see this a multiplicity of times in the introduction and exclusion of certain characters and characteristics, such as Legolas, Tauriel, and Tom Bombadil.
So we recognize that there are instances where there is creative license that can be taken with. When Tom Bombadil is left out of The Lord of the Rings, to a great enthusiast, it was myself. When I first saw it, I was just heartbroken that Tom Bombadil was not in the story, but could recognize that the omission was not necessarily a derivation from plot, which is different than maybe the addition to characters. So for us, we recognize that there is license to be taken there, but the problem in translation, as we'll talk about further, is when this is done because of commercialized motivation, or as Savelli will talk about, politicizing the story in the translation, that can become extremely problematic. So if it's in terms of creative license, like, we can't fit in Tom Bombadil, that's one thing. It's another thing to be just simply adding things in because it makes for a more sellable film or more sellable toys. So at this point, we wanted to actually give one more change in plot line that ends up interacting with the story on a deeper, more essential level. And that's in terms of the moral that is given within this. Because in the scholarship that we found relating to that of the Alistair MacIntyre Aristotelian virtue ethics tradition, that the story or narratives are a form of school in virtue. And so there is an essence of the school of virtue that I think Tolkien was trying to give that was a part of his authorship. And we think changes within that can have a significant impact upon what happens in the story. So at this point, Michael's going to give a brief example of that.
An example of this is how Jackson altered Tolkien's The Two Towers by blackening Faramir's character. He does this by having Faramir decide to take Frodo, Sam, and Gollum along with the One Ring to his father as a gift. This is not what he does in the book. Instead, Faramir chooses to do what he believes is right and allows his captives to go to Mordor to destroy the ring. Not only this, but he helps them on their way, giving them food and wonderful walking sticks. Faramir does this at the risk of his own life. Jackson substituted Faramir's character for a Nazgul Frodo confrontation set in one of Jackson's battles, as if he didn't have enough of those already.
So at this point, the real thing that we see is important here is that moral dimension that the school of virtue is teaching, not just in this, but in the narrative form itself, really relates to what we would consider, well, Tolkien talked about as big R reality. Fairy relates to reality itself. And for us, we believe that is tied to the moral realm itself as well. So there is a degree where we can have differences of what is and is not moral, but at least in terms of the authorship, it's important that the realm that he was creating, the story that he was creating, related to a certain moral that he was trying to advance. And within this, we recognize the details have a lot to be able to change and plotline as it relates to localized cultures. Savelli develops this in terms of one language to the next and how you can't have artificial translations that speak to the original, but that end up lacking, if you will, the magic or the cultural meaning and significance that it ought to carry with it. And so there are obviously details that have to change when moving from one culture to another, or in this matter, from the literary to the visual form. And in the paper, we talked about the artistic works of Sergei Lukamov. Is that how you say it? Lukamov? Um, in his depictions of the Lord of the Rings. And within that, you have a very Eastern iconographic style that we think, in many senses, it relates to more Tolkienian or westernized eyes in the impressionism that is there. It tells of the details in Leaf by Niggle are not necessarily realist. That's an important thing, to be able to have a realist connection, but there's also an impression that also has to carry with that. And Lukamov does a really good job, especially if one is familiar with the artistic tradition of the East, in translating those images, literary images, into visual images. And that really relates to that bigger, deeper feeling. In a couple of the articles we looked at, relate to not just the details of different environments culturally around the world, how that can be translated there, but there is a universal appreciation of Big B beauty itself that unites humankind together. And we think that's really a part of what fairy is doing. Which really brings us to our final point, is looking at on fairy story for principles of translation. And so the biggest part you're all probably very familiar with on fairy stories, but we see this as the details that add to the beauty and magic of the perilous realm of what is fairy. And for the sake of time, we're going to skip over the little part that we had here on how the details of the boots of Gandalf, of the details of the environment, really do contribute to the overall universal magic that is ingrained within fairy. So, more importantly, we wanted to end with how the nature of fairy is really established by the escape that is experienced within fairy, not escape from reality, but to reality, big R reality. That was found partially in the moral, but also connected most importantly is the eucatastrophe. And that is the essence of fairy. And so Michael's going to give a description really quickly of a couple stories that really fail in translation because they have no eucatastrophe in the translation.
Both the Lord of the Beans and the Lego Lord of the Rings function as exemplars of how the nature of fairy can be lost in depicting the story in illustrative form. Both these films turn characters into non-fairy type beings, i.e. vegetables and Legos. These depictions parody and trivialize the essence of fairy in the Lord of the Rings through their attempts to be humorous for the sake of a very young audience. The use of talking creatures such as vegetables and Legos in these instances does not make a story a fairy story. However, it is the translation into sellable children's films that most affects the nature of the stories. They do this by adding certain humorous aspects to the story. This comes in the form of the Nazgul putting out a fire with a fire extinguisher, and the use of face masks, a stretcher, and a medical kit after Frodo is stabbed by a Nazgul, and in many other small but important deviations. The worst deviation is when Boromir is killed by the Uruk-hai Lurks. This scene takes the self-sacrifice and redemption of Boromir and replaces it with a comical scene in which Boromir is shot with an arrow, a broom, and a banana, and almost a chicken. This absurdity is what has replaced one of the most touching and moving spots in all of Tolkien's work: the redemption, self sacrifice, and death of Boromir.
So at this point, we will end our presentation with saying we ended our paper by looking at other depictions of fairy in visual form, specifically those by Studio Ghibli, that have done an amazing job of creating a magical realm, a magical perilous realm of fairy that still has a heavy tie to a universal value of the eucatastrophe. So it is these ways that we developed these principles of translating both Tolkien and fairy into visual form. We hope you've enjoyed your presentation, and we look forward to taking questions. Thank you.